If you look at what the scientific evidence says, the data are very clear that a weekly session of high intensity interval training is protective compared to doing nothing. So if the choice is one weekly bout of vigorous exercise or remaining sedentary, the data is overwhelming that that weekly vigorous bout of exercise will be protective, more protective over the long term.
Welcome to the Movement and Performance Podcast, where my mission is to inspire you to move more and achieve your physical best. Today I have with me Dr. Martin Gibala. Dr. Gibala is a renowned exercise physiologist and professor at McMaster University, best known for his pioneering research on high-intensity interval training. His work demonstrates how short, intense workouts can deliver significant health and fitness benefits. In this episode, we'll be talking all about high-intensity interval training. Without further ado, let's get right into it. So to start off with just a definition, how would you define high intensity training?
Yeah, and so I think it's important to add the additional I in there, although, so high intensity interval training. And so really what we're talking there is intermittent exercise. So interval training is just that, intermittent exercise, hills and valleys. So going a little bit harder, backing off, repeating that pattern. And then the million-dollar question is, what is high? And so I think high, it depends if you're talking in a general health exercise prescription context or for athletes. But if it's exercise for general health, it's vigorous exercise, which is well defined in the public health guidelines. So the WHO would call vigorous exercise a 7 on a 10-point scale, where 0 or 1 is laying on the couch, 10 is sprint from danger, save your child from an oncoming car. 7 is just that. So it doesn't have to be all out maximal exercise. We're talking about 80% of your maximal heart rate. You couldn't carry on a conversation, you could eke out a few words. So that's sort of the range or the effort level that we're talking about. Now, athletes talk about training domains, moderate, heavy, severe. We're talking about the severe intensity domain. So it's not, why interval training is so potent for athletes is it allows them to work at a high percentage of their maximum and accumulate time spent there, more time than accumulated if you could do it in a continuous pace. So inherently it's intermittent in nature, and it's getting into this vigorous, severe intensity domain. Last point would be, a lot of people hear HIIT and they think, oh, it's only this as hard as you can go, all out gut busting type exercise. That's definitely one flavor, but it's not the only way to do interval training. I think a lot of people are turned off from the approach, especially less healthy individuals, people who are not regularly active, because they see it as a form of training that's only for high level athletes. And that's definitely not the case. Hundreds of studies now looking at individuals who are overweight, have obesity, with type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes in particular, cardiovascular disease in a cardiac rehab setting. So intensity is relative to the individual and has to be appropriately tailored.
So for the general population people, what would be the value of incorporating? Why go hard, right? Are there different gains? Are there better gains? Am I saving time? What's the benefit of high intensity training for a general population?
Yeah, so I think two ways to think of it. And so I would say one is there's definitely the efficiency aspect. And we talk efficiency, we're talking time efficiency. So individuals can get away with less time. Many people are interested in that question of how low can you go, right? How little can I get away with and still reap benefits? At the end of the day, there's no free lunch. If you want the benefits of time efficient exercise, you have to push. It has to be at a vigorous pace. But so there's the apples to oranges approach. And what I mean by that, many people are seemingly interested in this comparison of, well, you can do a very large dose or a large amount of the traditional moderate intensity continuous. What we've shown is that you can get away with a very small amount, a much smaller amount of high intensity interval training and still see similar gains. And in gains in things like cardiorespiratory fitness, your overall fitness, which we know is just such an important metric for all-cause mortality, your risk of dying from all causes, developing many different chronic conditions and diseases. Or the other way to think of it is the apples to apples comparison. for a given dose or amount of exercise, engaging in a more vigorous manner will lead to greater improvements. So I think the data
Mm,
is very clear, especially around fitness. If you're willing
mm.
and able to go harder periodically, you're going to see greater improvements in your fitness, and that, of course, leads to profound, improvements in your risk for not getting many of these chronic conditions.
Yeah, I almost think about it like with resistance training, right? If I want to see gains for resistance training, there's a certain threshold of how heavy you have to now start lifting. If you're lifting what you lift on a day-to-day basis, it's not going to be enough to create a stimulus. And it seems as though if we go harder in regard to energy systems, um, there's the potential to provide a stimulus for more gains. I guess, is that what you're kind of alluding to
Yeah,
there?
absolutely, right. And my colleague, Professor Stuart Phillips, who does a lot of resistance training work, he talks about wringing out the sponge, right? And this notion of for the first ring, you get a lot of water coming out, right? If you wring the sponge more and more, you see increasing amounts of water, but there's diminishing returns. And so the application there in interval training is it only takes a few bursts to be quite effective. The more you do it, athletes want to fully wring out the sponge, right? And so they're going to do lots and lots of interval training to try and optimize their performance. But a lot of people are interested in working at that other end, right? And I don't have to do too much of it, but you have to get it above this threshold to trigger
Mm.
these responses or physiological remodeling. And, we've done work with this, as have others, looking at literally molecular signaling pathways in your muscle that lead to skeletal muscle remodeling, new mitochondria. And we can trigger those with some short, hard intervals or the more
Mm.
traditional prolonged steady state stuff, which you have to do a much larger volume of.
It's interesting that you said mitochondria because um, one of the questions I was going to ask was about, are there different gains? Are there certain gains that you're maybe with that long, slow type of training that you might not be able to get? And one of my thought processes might have been something in the realm of mitochondria being more benefit or different, or I don't know. But are there certain um, benefits that someone is losing out on that they might not be able to get with that high intensity training?
Yeah, and I won't be that cautious scientist who hedges on every answer and says, well, it depends on that. But in some respects, it does depend. And one of the big things is how much are you doing, right? So we can't talk about these things in isolation and say, how does HIIT compare? Well, it does depend on what's the overall dose. If we start with athletes, the classic mix of training intensities for athletes, high level endurance athletes, is an 80-20 mix, right? They do 80% low, moderate, continuous stuff, 20% high intensity slash intervals, but they're training 25, 30 hours a week, right? And so
Right.
we know that prescription generally optimizes physiological responses, performance in athletes. The question then is, well, does that mean everyone has to train 80-20? And I would suggest no. I think as the training volume gets smaller, you can shift the ratio towards more high intensity, vigorous stuff because it's a more efficient or quality way to train, or for a given amount that you're putting into it, you can derive more benefits. And so, if you have an hour a week to devote to physical activity, I think you are leaving things on the table if you're only doing moderate continuous stuff. Now, moderate continuous stuff is a whole lot better than doing nothing, right? And our big problem writ large is just getting people to do something. But I would say if you want to optimize that hour, periodically, you need to be going hard. You need to be engaging in vigorous, high intensity stuff in order to get the best gains possible for that investment of time.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I'm sure it also depends on people's goals and things like what they like and all that stuff too. But generally speaking, if you want to provide a stimulus for change, you got to increase the intensity a little bit, it seems like. So,
Absolutely. These,
yeah,
these
no, go
messages
ahead.
that we hear, common ones are, move more, sit less. Those are great messages. But I think increasingly we could start to remind people, huffing and puffing once in a while, that's good for you, right?
Right.
So engage in some vigorous stuff once in a while. And there's just compelling data coming out, even 4 minutes a day of vigorous intensity physical activity compared to nothing, is just associated with marked improvements in health profile, marked reductions in risk. So it doesn't have to be a lot either in order to see these benefits.
Yeah. And a lot of that, I'm sure, comes to comfort, right? People don't want to be uncomfortable. But that's what change requires. You can't have change without being uncomfortable. So it kind of requires you to push it a bit, and get into that high intensity zone. So what are some of the physiological changes we might see from high intensity training or interval
So,
training?
so with again, and the best robust data is around cardiorespiratory fitness, and so which we objectively measure in the laboratory as a VO2 max test, right? And so that it what determines that is two main things: oxygen delivery and oxygen utilization. And so on the delivery side, we're talking about the ability of the heart to pump blood, the ability
Mm.
of the blood vessels to relax and be elastic and allow more blood and oxygen to flow. So you get benefits in your heart, lungs, blood on the delivery side, and you see improvements in your muscles, primarily in the tissue's ability to extract that oxygen and burn things like sugars and fats, right? And so you can perform more exercise without being fatigued. You can play with your grandkids. You can go upstairs without getting tired. So it's both of those things, the delivery side, the utilization side. And coming back to mitochondria, we know that this type of training is just a profound stimulus to grow more mitochondria, to be able to use the oxygen, as I said, burn sugars and fats, which is no doubt related to the improved health-related outcomes that we see as well.
Yeah, it's funny when I sometimes would place this in my mind. I would think more of that, and I guess let me actually ask this question first. Lactate threshold training, where you're kind of hovering that line, does that fall under the umbrella of high intensity, or does that fall more into an aerobic, or like where are we with that?
Yeah, and so even again, we can geek it out here a bit, but
Right.
I think a lot of people, they hear lactate threshold, and there's not necessarily sort of one magic point. Athletes will talk about the LT1 and LT2, right? So the first lactate threshold is generally that's what separates the moderate to severe training domain, and so below LT1, you can do continuous exercise till the cows come home, right? Like you can just go at a prolonged, steady state pace. LT2, that's sort of that dividing line between the heavy and the severe domain. Above LT2, that's sort of the definition of high intensity interval training for athletes. And so we've become very interested in something called critical power, which is it's not unlike lactate threshold training. Those are metabolic based thresholds. And I think lactate thresholds, critical power, those can be, while they're normally the realm of athletes, applying those concepts or this idea of metabolic threshold training for regular folks, that could really resonate rather than the traditional markers of what percent of maximal heart rate are you working at. So it's actually something we're really interested in our own research, is applying critical power-based training to try and get a similar physiological stimulus on people. And we think that might help enhance um, or reduce the wide variability that we see in responses. I could take 100 of your listeners, put them on the exact same interval training program. Some will thrive, some will wither, some will really gain a lot, some might not gain much at all. And we don't have a really good understanding of why that happens. So there's a lot of interest in trying to optimize that exercise prescription. And this is where that idea of threshold-based training comes in, whether it's lactate thresholds or critical power, critical speed training.
Tell me if I'm right. Critical power is the maximal amount of power you can sustain before you start going into a point where it's unsustainable.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's exactly right. And you're right. And so what you see is critical power. It shows what's called domain overlap. And so some people their critical power might be at 62% of heart rate max, and it might be at 85%. So if we just say everyone's going to train at 75%, some could go forever and some
Right.
wouldn't be able to go very long at all. But it comes back to that idea of, yes,
Right.
it's sustainable exercise, high intensity but sustainable work, which then identifying that threshold is important because people can sustain the high intensity or they have to do intermittent work because they get above that and they fatigue quite quickly. So you're spot on.
Yeah. And I used to, in my mind, again, I'm sure there's many different ways to be able to accomplish this stuff, but right about the tip of that critical power where you're starting to hover that line. If I can kind of stay there, and sometimes I go over a little and come back and over a little, come back over. And if I could sustain that for like 20 minutes or so, that might be a really powerful stimulus for mitochondrial. What I want to stress there is the mitochondria that I'm constantly, tipping on it. So in my mind, I almost thought that would be more, and I could be totally wrong, but more of a powerful approach for developing the mitochondria compared to getting too high in that high intensity threshold, or are both of them doing it? I don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I agree with you, and but the experimental evidence doesn't necessarily support that. But I thought of
Interesting.
that. Why don't we sort of get close to that red line all the time, and that should help me maybe race better or something. But and this gets into the athletes will debate polarized versus threshold training, and the best evidence would suggest that actually a polarized approach is better. Track coaches, old school track coaches would talk about make your hard days hard and your easy days easy, and not too much in that mushy middle, right? And
Right.
so that mushy middle can be too much of this threshold training or just redlining it. And the some of the best evidence would suggest that actually that polarized approach is probably better. So going really hard on the hard days, easy on the easy days, a little bit of threshold stuff, but not too much of it. And it was always perplexing to me because, like you, I think, well, wow, I wonder why that red line training isn't the best, but it doesn't seem to be.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. And I would assume, and tell me your thoughts on this as well, but especially for general population, including a variety. You even said for the athletes that 80-20, including some form of variety, because there is a little bit of elusiveness. We're not maybe fully sure. We can dabble in a lot of the high intensity, but it's nice to hit the spectrum. It's good to get variety. Variety helps prevent injury, and it might help get those marks that you're not hitting.
Agree entirely. And again, I know we have a varied audience here. Some are, very into athlete training and performance, but a lot of people are just interested in general health. I think for the vast majority of folks, uh, variety's best. The best exercise, the best thing is consistency, right? So
Right.
find something you like and enjoy and just be consistent at it over the long term. That's the best bet. But I agree, if like, going back to that person who has an hour a week to exercise, you know, do some continuous steady state stuff, throw in some intervals, and do some resistance exercise as well. I liken it to it's the investing model, right? And so for most of us, we're better off investing in mutual funds. We don't know what's going to be the hot stock. We don't know what's really going to take off and work for us. And so you're better off spreading the risk a little bit. And so I think it comes the same thing with fitness. You're better off doing all of these things or incorporating into to some extent.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on in regard to assessing? I know people get, for lack of a better term, I'm gonna, we're allowed to curse on this podcast, but my father would say picking the fly shit out of the pepper. I don't know if you've heard that one before, but sometimes I think we get so in depth with some of these, the VO2 max tests and this and that for general population, it might not be needed as needed as much. And I think it's still valuable, very, very valuable. But what are your thoughts on maybe just something like a 1 mile run test? I think that's a great, just do that for a little while. And if you're consistent with that, then you can move on to you're nerding out with VO2 max and everything else. But if you haven't even done a 1 mile run test, like I don't know if there's a point for you to then start to, pick the fly shit out of the pepper type of thing.
No, I agree, and I agree in that. Like, I think people should have a good idea of what their fitness is, but there's lots of ways to assess that. They don't need to do a gold standard VO2 max test in the lab. There's really good predictive tests out there, whether it's a 1 mile run, whether it's a YMCA step test, whether it's a shuttle run, the old classic beep test that you used to do in high school and grade school, any of those, like there's a number of, pick one that's validated. At least there's some evidence where we show that this predictive test correlates or has some validity compared to the gold standard. But I agree, just pick one of those so that you can get a marker in the sand, and then you can track progress over time. Are you getting better with your program? Are you at least maintaining your fitness? Just pick some measure of functional capacity and assess it over time, and that can easily be a simple predictive test.
Yeah, I like that you added the fact of picking something that's standardized, though, because now you can actually compare it, right? A 1 mile run test, we have a bunch of, you can look at men your age or women your age and compare it to something. And, there's a standard of how it should be done. And so that was a great little addition there.
And I liken it sometimes to, bioelectrical impedance, right? That you might have heard this test for body composition. It's
Sure.
not awesome, but it's not bad, and it's fairly reproducible, right? So even if the numbers accuracy is a little bit off, it's still a pretty good test to repeat over time, right? So if you're making changes to your diet or you want to see if your body composition changes, you can do a BIA test repeatedly. It's an easy test to do. It's a bit the same with these submaximal predictive tests, but you're right. Having it standardized or having some values that you can compare to so you can get yourself in a range or just have an idea, am I the lowest fitness level or am I doing okay here for sort of my age? And that is important.
And I believe that there's some research to support that a 1 mile run test and, there's some overlap to what your VO2 max would be. Am I right with that?
Absolutely. Yes.
Right.
Yes, for sure. So almost any of these submaximal tests are well correlated with VO2 max, the gold standard that you'd measure in the lab.
Right. So people, it's giving you that value. If you can't run that mile and you can't do it in a decent time, that's telling you you need to work on your VO2 max. It's giving you a good predictor.
Yeah. And there's even, you can find lots of things online, but there is a good non-exercise calculator online. So if your audience just wants to Google world fitness level, there's an online calculator available at World Fitness Level that's the best one that's out there. It's based on extensive research led out of Norway. And it will ask people a series of questions, right? Including their age, their biological sex, and it'll ask some things like, what's your resting heart rate? And it'll give you a reasonable estimate. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to give you a reasonable estimate of your fitness. And there's even published research to show that calculator has been used to predict mortality in individuals, and it's held up surprisingly well. So, any exercise test is better than a non-exercise test, but if you just want a snapshot that doesn't require any exercise at all, World Fitness Level calculator, it's a good place to start.
Nice. What are some different styles of high intensity interval training? Like, I'm sure sky's the limit here, but maybe if there's a couple popular ones that you can share and protocols that people can know so that they can implement.
Yeah, for sure. And so one nice thing is, there's an old saying, your heart doesn't know what your muscles are doing. And so at least when it comes to aerobic style exercise, doesn't matter if it's running, elliptical, cycling, swimming, rucking outside, any of those things sort of count. But in terms of common protocols, so the classic Norwegian protocol would be 4 4-minute efforts, right? And you can imagine here, all of these are intensity duration trade-offs, right? So if I'm talking a 20-second interval versus 4 minutes, the intensity that required there is different. But the classic Norwegian protocol, 4 4-minute efforts with a couple minutes recovery, 2 to 3 minutes in between there. So start to finish, you're talking 30 to 35 minutes, right? That's not necessarily time efficient training, but that's a very common protocol where you're getting up to that 80% of heart rate zone, at least in every one of the intervals, right? It doesn't mean you have to be at 80% for the entire interval, but by the end of the interval, as 1 minute into a 4-minute interval, you're like, okay, this is challenging, but I'm feeling pretty good. But by 3.5 minutes, you're like, okay, I'm ready for this interval to be done, right? So you can self-select the pace there such that you recover again for 2 or 3 minutes. You go back and you go again, and at least every time your heart rate's getting above that 80%. So that's a really common one. little more time efficient approach. We used to study the 10 by 1. So this is 10 1-minute efforts with 1 minute recovery. So they're 20, 25 minutes with a little bit of warm up and cool down. That's a really potent way, but there's increasing research to show, getting back to the sponge analogy or ringing the sponge, 5 by 1 is almost as good. So if you just want to do a 5 by 1 protocol, start to finish, that's less than 15 minutes for sure, with a little bit of warm up and cool down. Really, really effective. Obviously, there the absolute intensity in the 1-minute intervals higher than you'd be doing in the 4-minute, right? And then the last one, and where the name of my book, The 1-Minute Workout, comes from, we've done studies looking at 3 20-second all-out bursts. So these are really, really hard. Sprinting as hard as you can uphill, getting on a bike, putting it as high as you can sustain and going as hard as you can for 20 seconds. So after 15 seconds, it's hard to turn the pedals. Really, really potent interval training, but even 3 20-second bursts in a 10-minute total time commitment can be very effective to boost your VO2 max, to increase mitochondria. So there's 3 examples that sort of span the gamut in terms of time and intensity. And then the last one would be, you can do resistance style. It's a classic bodyweight style interval training. If you have some simple equipment, kettlebells, maybe, on a bench or something like that, or just classic calisthenics, bodyweight style interval training can be really good. It's a nice hybrid style of training, right? You keep the recovery period short, you get the cardiovascular training, but you get the strength training benefit as well. Not as good as classic heavy strength training, not as good as classic endurance training, but a pretty good middle ground type workout to get some benefits of both.
Great. When it comes to heart rate training zones, high intensity would fall under which, if we're going with the typical 1 to 5, is that what you use, a 1 to 5 zone? And what would
that's
it fall
fine.
on?
Yeah, and so sorry to interrupt there, but
Yeah.
general rule of thumb is getting above 80% of maximum, right? Generally getting above 80% of maximum, which in a lot of training zone systems, that's zone 4 or zone 5, depending how it's divided up. But you're sort of at least getting into that yellow zone, right? You don't have to be redlining it, but you're getting into the yellow zone where it's a challenging pace, right? You're a little bit out of breath for sure. You wouldn't want to have a conversation with your workout partner beside you. You could spit out a few words, but you're not looking at a conversation. So that's the sort of intensity range we're getting to. But for me, getting above 80%, that's sort of the rule of thumb for getting into that vigorous zone.
What should people feel as they're shifting from, if they're moving in and out of these zones, right? So when I go from 2 to 3 or 3 to 4, 4 to 5, what should I feel in my body? Recently I've been using markers more than anything. So for example, when I go in the sauna, one of the first markers I wait for is once I start to sweat. If I start to sweat, something is changing, something's happening in me, right? I don't have to necessarily have a special watch or anything. I know I'm sweating, something's changing. So are there any markers that we would feel and see in our body that would let us know that we're getting into these different zones?
Yeah, so perception of the effort, it's so individualized, but it's such a robust marker. And so if people can start to get these anchors where certainly, knowing what a 10 out of 10 pace is, or imagining what a 10 out of 10 is. And again, it's that sprint from danger or save your child from an oncoming car pace, like the absolute hardest you could go. We're not requiring you to do that, but getting to 70 or 80% of that, right? That's 70 or 80%. For most people, the chest is pounding a little bit, right? It's not pounding like your heart's gonna come out of your chest, but you're feeling that perception of effort there. Sweating's a tough one because especially with the short intervals, you could imagine an all-out flat sprint for 15 seconds, the sweat comes later, right?
Right.
So the harder you go, there's this disconnect between the initial perceived effort and sort of the payback after, right? Like you sprint, you sprint to catch the bus, or you're late for a train and you sprint, you get on the train and then it starts, right? Then you really feel like you're huffing and puffing. So there's that inherent lag or delay. So some of these subjective cues can be challenging. But again, coming back to that idea of, maybe even doing a graded exercise test on your own. Pick your favorite piece of equipment, whether it's an elliptical, running, swimming, whatever, and just try to go, what is my working range here? Right? If I had to do a flat out 50-meter sprint, okay, I'm going to back off 10 or 20% from that. What does that feel like, right? Where I still got a little bit left in the tank, but I'm not quite there yet. But again, you want to get into that uncomfortable area a little bit, right? So when we coach interval training with people, we'll initially say, just get out of your comfort zone. Wherever you are right now, give me 10% more than that, right? So you feel a little bit more out of breath. You feel like you're breathing a little bit harder. You feel like your heart rate's up a little bit more. That is starting to get into interval training intensity for you.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like perceived exertion, so what you feel, and comfort, which would make a lot of sense to me. If you are not uncomfortable, you are not in a higher zone. It's
That
kind of that simple.
it really is, right? And that uncomfortableness can appeal to people if they can get away with a lot less of it, right? Like, again, let's be clear here. There's no free lunch, right? If you want the
Right.
benefits of this type of training, you got to get out of your comfort zone. But some people will seemingly trade, hey, I can do my workout. I get on my bike, pop on Netflix, and I'll ride, I'll shut my mind off for an hour. And it's pretty easy. That's fine. If that type of training appeals to you, great, right? But if I could say, hey, get out of your comfort zone and watch a 20-minute show and you're going to get the same quality workout, how do you feel about that trade-off? Again, it comes back to individual differences. We're not saying this is a panacea or for everyone, or it's the cure for the obesity epidemic or anything like that, but it is a very functional, efficient way for people to train, and that appears to be quite appealing, especially for people who are interested in time savings.
And what are your thoughts on, I know most general population participating in some type of sport sometimes isn't always easy to do. But I almost feel like the uncomfort becomes a bit disguised, or you're so focused on something else that you're not paying attention to it. I know when I play ultimate frisbee, for example, I run extremely hard, right? And I get more steps. I go a lot longer. And I do it with just the motivation of, maybe I'm also motivated by that, of like, seeing an opponent and running around them. But I'm so distracted. There's not one point I'm ever thinking really about, the idea of like, oh, I have to do this thing that, it's just, I'm in there. And then afterwards, I'm like, wow, I did a lot. And there are moments of uncomfort where I'm like, wow, sucking wind, and I can tell. But I think I'm so focused on other goals in that moment that, I'm not paying attention to it. And what do
Agreed.
you,
Yeah,
yeah, go for it.
team sport is almost inherently the stop and go nature of it. You're getting into an interval training area. And so again, it comes back, find what you like and enjoy and stick with it. I'm clearly someone who's a committed exerciser. I can get on my bike in the basement and do an interval workout, but my favorite workout of the week is going to be this afternoon in a couple of hours. We're recording this on a Friday. I play a weekly pickup ice hockey game with a bunch of
Wow,
buddies.
cool. Very
And,
cool.
we debate after, and we have what's, so ice hockey's 3 periods, and then we have fourth period, which is the beer at the bar after, which everyone looks forward to, and is that exercise? Is it play? Is it a bit of both, right? And to your point, I'm not a very good hockey player, so every workout is really hard for me, right? Every shift is very hard just to try and keep up, but it's a great workout, but I'm not thinking about it when I'm out there, right? And so it's just, I think, a great example of what you're talking about there. Team sport, playing with others, having a partner. These can be very motivating ways for people to engage in this type of activity.
Yeah, I always tell people you don't have to be good to reap the benefits. And if you think about participating in sport for these other reasons, maybe you'll be, more enticed to do it. But yeah, the benefits for your brain, the benefits for your body, the benefits for, like, it goes on and on and on. And you don't have to be good. I think that's the biggest issue, though, is the lack of confidence. And people that don't have a positive association with certain sports, maybe they were picked on when they were young, maybe they didn't have a good PE teacher, maybe they didn't get out much, whatever it is, now trying to overcome that, it is very, very challenging. But I think if people can understand that there's a lot of people that are on that same boat, that didn't have a positive association with moving. Start small, and you can participate in sport with other people who are at your level. There's beginner leagues out there. Don't try to join, back to the ultimate frisbee piece. I'll use that example. There's some advanced players. If I jumped in with them first, I'd say, oh, this isn't for me. I suck. Or I would have, start small, find a beginner league, find other people that, some people call it beer leagues too. Like you said, you grab a beer after, but find something that's at your level, start small. And even if you're not good, remember, you're still getting the benefits. So that might motivate you a bit out there.
No, agree. And, look for a supportive environment, right? If a supportive gym or a supportive league, and if you don't feel supported, or, if it reminds you of those awful days from high school, go find another league, right? My wife is sporty. She played competitive soccer and still plays competitive soccer now, but she picked up ice hockey at 40, right? She learned to skate with a bunch of 7 and 8-year-olds, and now she plays in a women's league in our city. But it was a very supportive league, right? So there's a whole bunch of different levels. And so I think, to your point, that's what you're looking for. I try to, my goal now is to get less bad as I age. So try and maintain my fitness.
Right.
And so as the other guys are hopefully tailing off quicker than me, I will be relatively better the older I get. That's the way I look at it from a motivating standpoint.
And the sport provides the environment that creates the natural intervals, right? It's just there. The hills and valleys are there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Are there any safety concerns people should worry about?
Yeah, of course. And so, I mean, ideally, everyone checks with their family doctor, their physician, before they start or change an exercise regime. Is it realistic that everyone is going to get a 12-lead ECG stress test before they become physically active? No. And so I think a couple things. One, it's important to remember right now, the physical activity guidelines for Americans, for Canadians, from the WHO advocate moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity for all adults, including older adults. And so if you accept that interval training starts at this vigorous range, don't do the crazy stuff. Don't do the all-out intense, high intensity stuff. But vigorous exercise is advocated for all adults right now in the physical activity guidelines worldwide. So, but be smart. The old go slow, go start low, go slow. That makes sense. You can do interval training at a moderate pace to start. So for some people, if your only exercise right now is walking down the block to get your mail, an interval workout for you is picking up the pace for a few light posts, backing off, and doing it again, right? So just accepting that intermittent physical activity can be beneficial, and then you build intensity from there. Clearly there's some people who vigorous exercise is absolutely contraindicated for, if I have unstable angina, things like that. But that's where you should be talking to your physician and getting some good advice there. But going back to this beer league hockey analogy, we'll read sometimes in the paper, there'll be a tragic story about the 45-year-old who had a heart attack on the ice and passed away. And those, of course, are tragic individual circumstances. But if you look at what the scientific evidence says, the data are very clear that a weekly session of high intensity interval training is protective compared to doing nothing. So if the choice is one weekly bout of vigorous exercise or remaining sedentary, the data is overwhelming that weekly vigorous bout of exercise will be more protective over the long term. So I think, we need to put intensity in perspective. Many more people than we think can safely perform and benefit from an interval-based approach. And there's just so much evidence for that now. But again, ideally get checked before you start low, go slow at the beginning. Second point is around musculoskeletal risk, especially as we get older. We have joint issues and things like that. This is where, interval training on a bike is completely different from interval training running, right? We're not suggesting that someone who has bad knees should be running uphill as hard as they can. I'm someone, I can't run anymore. I have classic knee osteoarthritis. I can still skate, but I can cycle very, very intensely. So again, that it depends, is the exercise weight bearing or not? And so you can engage in high intensity exercise even if you have joint mobility issues. You just have to pick the exercises that are suited.
Right. Yeah. Something you were saying before made me think of something, I always say you can die off the couch, but you could die on it too. So
Absolutely. We you go into a gym, you go into a physician, you go to all these places, and it's like, stop the risks of physical activity. It's like, I think we need to remind people that the greater risk is just remaining sedentary, right?
right,
Like
right, right,
that writ large is the greatest risk, and our best indicator is coming back to fitness. And that's where you
right.
need a marker in the sand for what your fitness is.
Yeah. And then there's fast death and slow death, right? And when you're on the couch, it's a slow death. And to be honest, I'd much rather the fast one. I think the guillotine is a better way to go,
Yeah, and we talk about, obviously there's a lot of interest now in health span versus lifespan. Lifespan, of course,
Right.
how long you're going to live, but health span is, how close to the ceiling you can work. And I think the other thing with regular physical activity, it really advances health span. So, when you do start to tail off, it's a more sharp, steep decline towards the end rather than this slow, gradual decline, which really takes some time and makes for very poor quality of life.
As we start to come to a close here, are there any, just opening the floor to you, are there any important points that maybe we might have missed that you want to share? Yeah, just opening the floor, and you also don't have to.
No, it's fine. I think the last one would be, a lot of people are interested in exercise for weight loss, as I'm sure many of your listeners would be aware. It's more the energy inside of things there, and you'll often see overstatement around the potential for HIIT to melt away pounds and stuff like that.
Mm,
Clearly, interval training can play a role in supporting weight management, and that the idea of efficiency comes into play. Yes, you can get a greater calorie burn in a shorter period of time, but I think it's important that we don't overstate the potential for weight loss with this type of training. And I come back to this idea that fitness is the number one driver, right? So in 6 weeks, it might be hard to lose any weight or change that number on the scale, but you can definitely boost your fitness by 10% or so, and that's going to just markedly pay off. So, the messaging around worry less about the number on the scale, worry more about your fitness.
mm.
That's really, really important, I think, to keep in mind.
Yeah, a big piece for me is also thinking just about freedom and expression. Like I know for myself, and this is my own personal bias, but it's very hard for me to give up high intensity stuff because it's enjoyable and it gives me access to so much more. Like I can't imagine a life where I just walk and sit, you know? And so there's a whole degree of freedom that's gained by having the access to be able to sprint if I needed
Yeah.
to be able to do these things and play certain games or whatever it is, you
No,
know?
we talk about functional reserve, right? And it's fine, it's fine to worry about VO2 max, the ceiling, but most of life is below, we work below the ceiling, right? And that's this idea of functional reserve, functional capacity. What's sort of the minimum fitness you need for everyday life? And so many folks, especially you get into middle age, you're redlining it right around that minimum for functional capacity. To your point, there's no reserve there. And so what you want to do is build up a bit of reserve. So, you get off the plane, the escalator's out. You don't want to be that person who's stuck waiting at the bottom. You want to be able to grab your luggage, hef up the stairs if you have to, and not be flat out tired for the rest of the day. Or you gotta chase your grandkid because they're not behaving that day. You want to be able to chase them down and then go off and keep playing. Not that you get above that threshold even for a minute there, and there's not a lot of insurance or reserve left. So to your point, it's about building up that functional reserve so it's there when you need it.
Yeah, and it's a deep mind-body connection. Your mind is mimicking your body is mimic your mind. And I think if you feel confident, you feel strong, if you can sprint, if you feel like I got this, now like mentally, you're gonna walk around just much different. The way you feel, the way you act, the way you behave, who you talk to, your career, literally everything in your life starts to change because of this confidence you're gaining from the access your body's has, I think.
No, I agree. You don't want to be that zebra at the back of the pack that gets picked off, right? You want to at least be in the middle there. So
At least, right? Yeah. So, man, thank you so much for today. This is a really good conversation. I appreciate your time. I know you have a lot going on and, well sought after. So I appreciate you making the time for this.
No, Anthony, I appreciate the questions, appreciate the opportunity. I'm glad we were able to find time for this. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.